Part 1. The world he knew. Malcolm had always been a fighter. Born in a small, tight-knit community, he was raised on principles of integrity, respect, and the constant awareness that his skin color made him a target. His mother used to tell him, "Malcolm, the world won't give you anything freely. You'll have to fight for your dignity, every day." Those words rang true from a young age. He experienced his first encounter with racism at the tender age of 8 when a classmate, unprovoked, hurled an insult that stung more than any playground fall ever could. Over the years, these encounters became more frequent. He grew up learning how to navigate an unjust world, suppressing his anger, avoiding confrontations, and always working twice as hard to prove he was as good as, if not better than, anyone else. By the time he reached adulthood, Malcolm had learned to blend in, to wear the mask of calmness, even as indignities piled up, chipping away at his spirit bit by bit. Still, he believed in the law, believed in justice. His father had been a police officer, and despite all the horrors Malcolm had seen, he clung to the belief that people were inherently good. It was this belief that kept him afloat in a world that constantly tried to drown him. Part 2. The incident. It was an ordinary day. Malcolm had finished his shift as a mechanic and was heading home, exhausted but satisfied after a day of hard work. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows on the suburban street as he made his way through his neighborhood. The hum of cicadas filled the air, and the distant laughter of children playing in the park brought a sense of normalcy. He had just reached the corner of Elm and 5th when he saw the patrol car. It was nothing new, police regularly patrolled the area, but something felt off. The car slowed down as it neared him, and he felt the familiar tension creep into his muscles. Malcolm's instincts told him to keep walking, to mind his own business, and yet, he couldn't help but glance at the car. The windows rolled down, revealing 2 officers inside. They looked at him, eyes cold, devoid of warmth or recognition. The younger one, with a shaved head and a sneer, stepped out. "You fit the description," the officer said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, but laced with something darker, something Malcolm had encountered far too many times in his life. "Description?" Malcolm asked, keeping his voice calm. He knew better than to show fear or defiance. "Yeah. Got a report of someone causing trouble around here. Black male, mid-30s, wearing a white shirt. That sound familiar?" Malcolm looked down at his clothes, a white t-shirt stained with grease from the shop, jeans, and worn sneakers. He knew it wasn't him they were looking for. It was never really about finding the right person, was it? "I've been at work all day," Malcolm replied, his voice steady but tense. "I'm just heading home." The other officer, who had stayed in the car until now, stepped out, his hand resting on his holster. "Let's just make sure of that," he said, his voice low. Something inside Malcolm snapped. For years, he had swallowed his pride. For years, he had kept his head down, knowing the cost of standing up to the system. But now, standing under the weight of their gaze, something broke free inside him. He felt the heat rise in his chest, felt his fists clench involuntarily. "You don't have to do this," Malcolm said, taking a deep breath to calm the fire building inside. "I told you, I've been working. You're wasting your time." But they didn't listen. "Hands where I can see them," the first officer barked. Malcolm hesitated for just a second, and in that moment, everything changed. The officers' hands went to their weapons, and the world slowed down. "I'm not going to let this happen," Malcolm whispered to himself, more as a prayer than a statement. But as the officers advanced, the glint of metal in their hands, Malcolm felt a surge of survival instinct he hadn't known was still inside him. He turned, bolting down the street. Part 3. The pursuit. Malcolm's heart pounded in his chest as his feet pounded the pavement. He could hear the heavy footfalls of the officers behind him, the shouts of "Stop" and "Get down," ringing in his ears, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Years of fear, anger, and injustice propelled him forward. This wasn't just a chase, this was about survival. Malcolm knew the odds. He'd seen the news stories, heard about what happened to men who looked like him in these situations. He wasn't going to be another headline. He darted down an alley, the familiar layout of the neighborhood giving him a momentary advantage. He could hear the officers radioing for backup, but he didn't care. He had to keep moving. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. The park, if he could just make it to the park, maybe he'd have a chance, but as Malcolm rounded the corner, he stumbled. His foot caught on a crack in the pavement, and he went down hard, the rough concrete scraping his hands and knees. Pain shot up his leg as he tried to push himself up, but it was too late. The officers were on him. Part 4, the confrontation. Stay down, one of the officers shouted as they approached, guns drawn. Malcolm struggled to get to his feet, but a sharp pain in his leg kept him grounded. He glanced down and saw blood, a deep gash from where he'd fallen. "Don't move," the second officer yelled, his weapon trained on Malcolm's chest. Malcolm raised his hands, palms facing out, his heart racing. "I didn't do anything," he panted, trying to catch his breath. "I'm just trying to go home." But they didn't hear him. They didn't see him, not the real him. To them, he was just another threat. Another black man who needed to be subdued. The first officer stepped forward, his face twisted in anger. "You think you can run from us?" he snarled, grabbing Malcolm by the collar and yanking him up. Malcolm winced as pain shot through his leg again. "I didn't do anything," he repeated, his voice hoarse, but the officer wasn't listening. He slammed Malcolm against the wall, his face inches away, his breath hot and rancid. "You think we're stupid? You think we won't put you down right here?" Fear gripped Malcolm's chest, but so did something else, defiance. He wasn't going to let them break him. Not again. "I didn't do anything wrong," Malcolm said, his voice steady despite the pain. For a moment, there was silence. The officer stared at him, his eyes burning with hatred. Then, without warning, he swung. The punch connected with Malcolm's jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain exploded in his head, but he forced himself to stay conscious. He couldn't black out now. Not like this. Part 5, the turning point. As Malcolm lay on the ground, blood trickling from his mouth, something inside him shifted. He had spent his entire life being beaten down by a world that refused to see him as human. He had endured humiliation, degradation, and violence, always believing that if he just kept his head down, if he just played by the rules, he could survive. But survival wasn't enough anymore. Slowly, Malcolm pushed himself up to his knees, his body screaming in protest. His vision was blurry, and his leg throbbed with pain, but he refused to stay down. "I'm not going to let you kill me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The officers paused, surprised by the quiet defiance in his words. Malcolm's heart raced, but his mind was clear. This was his stand. This was his fight, and he wasn't going to lose. Part 6, the struggle for dignity. The street was quiet now, the distant sounds of the city fading into the background as Malcolm knelt in the middle of the road. Blood dripped down his leg, pooling on the pavement beneath him, but he didn't care. All he could focus on were the two men standing in front of him, their guns still drawn, their faces twisted in anger and confusion. "I'm done running," Malcolm said, his voice steady despite the pain coursing through his body. "I've been running my whole life, and I'm done." The officers exchanged glances, unsure of what to do next. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. The suspect was supposed to comply, to beg for mercy, to cower in fear. But Malcolm wasn't doing any of that. "I didn't do anything wrong," Malcolm repeated, his voice gaining strength. "And I'm not going to let you take my dignity from me." One of the officers stepped forward, his face a mask of frustration. "You don't get to decide that," he spat, his hand tightening on his gun. But Malcolm didn't flinch. He met the officer's gaze head-on, his eyes filled with a quiet, unyielding strength. "Yes, I do." And in that moment, something shifted. The tension in the air seemed to break as the officers hesitated, unsure of how to. Epilogue, continued. The seeds of change. Months after the verdict, Malcolm's life transformed into something he never expected. He went from being an ordinary man, simply trying to live his life, to a figure at the center of a growing movement. His once quiet existence as a mechanic had given way to interviews, speeches, and the constant flow of attention from media outlets and activists alike. He had become a reluctant symbol of resistance, not by choice, but by circumstance. The neighborhood that had once been his sanctuary now seemed smaller, as if the world outside had encroached upon it. Every day, people stopped him on the streets, sometimes offering words of support, sometimes simply wanting to shake his hand and express solidarity. But not everyone viewed him as a hero. Some called him a troublemaker, an instigator. They claimed he had made the police look bad, that he had overblown the situation. Even though Malcolm knew the truth, these remarks weighed heavily on him. At night, alone in his small apartment, he often found himself questioning whether he was truly ready for the weight of this new role. After all, he had only wanted to go home that fateful night. Now, home felt like a distant memory, a place lost in the whirlwind of public attention. Yet, deep down, Malcolm understood that his fight was part of something much bigger than himself. This wasn't just about clearing his name or seeking justice for one night's events, it was about confronting an entire system built on inequality and fear. It was about ensuring that others wouldn't have to face the same threats, the same indignities he had faced. Part 9. The community awakens. In the aftermath of Malcolm's case, the city began to change in small but significant ways. Community leaders, inspired by his story, began organizing forums and town halls to address the growing concerns about racial profiling and police violence. Malcolm, though uncomfortable with the attention, attended many of these meetings. He wasn't a politician, wasn't a public speaker, but he knew that his presence meant something to the people who had rallied behind him. At these gatherings, Malcolm shared his experience with raw honesty. He didn't sugarcoat the pain, the humiliation, or the fear he'd felt that night. But he also spoke of the hope that had come from standing up for himself, the dignity he'd reclaimed in the process. His words resonated deeply with those who had experienced similar struggles, but who had never felt empowered to speak up. "We're stronger together," he said at one meeting. "They want us to stay silent, to stay afraid. But if we stand together, if we demand justice, demand our humanity be recognized, then they can't ignore us anymore." Malcolm's message spread, not just in his city, but across the country. Activists and civil rights organizations began to amplify his story, using it as a call to action for broader reforms. His case was cited in news articles, documentaries, and political speeches as a pivotal moment in the ongoing struggle for racial equality. Malcolm, who had once felt alone and overwhelmed, now found himself part of a much larger network of individuals and groups fighting for change. The movement, however, wasn't just about protests and speeches. Concrete steps were being taken. Police departments across the city were pressured to implement new training programs focused on de-escalation and anti-bias practices. Community police relations committees were formed, giving local residents a voice in how their neighborhoods were patrolled. The lawsuit that had once seemed like a personal battle for Malcolm became a catalyst for real, structural change. But change, Malcolm knew, wasn't easy or quick. For every victory, there was resistance. Many in the police department resented the reforms, claiming they were being unfairly targeted. Tensions flared during some of the meetings, and Malcolm often found himself the target of thinly veiled hostility, both from law enforcement and from certain segments of the community who believed he had caused trouble. Yet, through it all, Malcolm stood firm. He had learned a valuable lesson that night, one that stayed with him long after the bruises had healed. Dignity wasn't something given, it was something you had to fight for, every day. And Malcolm was prepared to keep fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, voiceless, or powerless. Part 10. A father's legacy. Amid all the public turmoil, Malcolm found himself thinking often about his father. His father had been a cop, one of the good ones, as people used to say. But even his father, for all his honor and integrity, had been part of a system that Malcolm now saw as deeply flawed. It was a system that, while capable of great good, was also built on foundations of exclusion, mistrust, and fear. Malcolm remembered the stories his father would tell at the dinner table. Tales of catching bad guys, protecting innocent people, and keeping the peace. As a child, Malcolm had looked up to his father, admiring him for his bravery and sense of duty. But as he grew older, he started to see the cracks in the system his father had so faithfully served. He remembered one conversation in particular, shortly before his father passed away. They had been sitting on the porch, the sun setting on a quiet summer evening. Malcolm, then a teenager, had asked his father if he ever felt conflicted about being a black man in a police force that seemed to target black people. His father had been quiet for a long time before finally speaking. "It's complicated, son," he had said. "I believe in the law. I believe in justice. But sometimes the system doesn't work the way it should. And when that happens, it's up to people like me, and people like you, to try and make it right." At the time, Malcolm hadn't fully understood what his father meant. But now, in the wake of everything that had happened, those words echoed in his mind with new clarity. In many ways, Malcolm realized, his father had been fighting the same battle he was now waging. His father had believed in the potential for change, even from within a system that so often resisted it. And now, it was Malcolm's turn to carry that torch. Part 11, Rebuilding. Brick by brick, as the weeks turned into months, and the months into a year, Malcolm's life began to settle into a new rhythm. The media frenzy died down, and the protests, while still present, became less frequent. The lawsuit he had filed resulted in a substantial settlement, part of which he used to pay for his legal fees and medical bills. But the majority of the money, Malcolm decided, would be put to use for the community. He partnered with local activists and organizations to establish a community center, a safe space for young people, especially those from marginalized communities, to learn, grow, and thrive. The center offered mentorship programs, job training, and educational workshops. But more than that, it provided a place where people could come together, share their experiences, and support one another. Malcolm named the center after his father, the Samuel Carter Justice Center. At the opening ceremony, Malcolm stood before the crowd, feeling a mix of pride and humility. He had come a long way from that night on the street, a night that could have ended so differently. But here he was, not just surviving, but building something lasting, something that would outlive him and continue the fight for justice long after he was gone. As he spoke to the crowd, Malcolm's voice was steady and clear. "This center is about more than just resources or programs. It's about community. It's about making sure that every person, no matter where they come from or what they look like, knows that they matter. That their dignity is worth fighting for." The crowd applauded, but Malcolm's mind was already thinking about the future. There was still so much work to be done. But for the first time, he didn't feel overwhelmed. He felt ready. Part 12. The long road ahead. Even as Malcolm found peace in his new role, the world around him continued to evolve. The movement for racial justice, ignited by so many lives lost and stories untold, grew stronger each day. There were setbacks, of course, moments of despair when the system pushed back harder than ever before. But there were also victories, small and large, that fueled the hope for a better future. Malcolm continued to speak, to organize, to push for change. He traveled to other cities, other communities, sharing his story and listening to others. He became a voice for those who couldn't speak, an advocate for those who had been silenced. But through it all, Malcolm never lost sight of the fact that the fight for dignity was not a sprint, it was a marathon. It was a long, winding road, full of challenges and obstacles. But it was a road worth walking, no matter how difficult. And as he looked out at the world he had helped to shape, Malcolm knew one thing for certain: he would keep walking that road. Not just for himself, but for his father, for his community, and for all those who came after him, because dignity wasn't just something to be won in a single battle, it was something to be earned, protected, and passed on, and Malcolm was ready to carry that torch as far as it needed to go. 7. They were used to confrontation, to suspects who either complied out of fear or resisted in anger, but this was different. Malcolm wasn't pleading for mercy, nor was he lashing out in rage. Instead, he was standing firm, demanding respect, demanding dignity. For a moment, the officer's hand hovered over his weapon, his expression caught between indecision and frustration. He had power, authority, but in Malcolm's unwavering stare, he felt a sudden vulnerability, a fracture in the control he thought he had. "Stand down," a voice cut through the tension. From behind them, more officers had arrived. "Back up," Malcolm assumed. They emerged from their cars, weapons drawn, but it was clear from the shift in their posture that they hadn't expected to walk into this kind of scene. A supervisor, a tall, graying man with a hardened face, stepped between Malcolm and the two officers. "What's going on here?" the supervisor barked, eyeing the situation with sharp scrutiny. His tone was all business, but the subtle concern behind it didn't escape Malcolm. "He ran," the younger officer explained, clearly on edge, trying to regain his composure. "We had to pursue. He resisted." "I didn't resist," Malcolm interrupted, his voice calmer now. He locked eyes with the supervisor, his chest still heaving but his words deliberate. "I ran because I was afraid. But I didn't resist. I just want to go home." The supervisor glanced between the officers and Malcolm, his frown deepening as he took in the scene. Malcolm, bleeding and battered but still upright, still defiant, the two officers, tense and defensive, their weapons still in hand. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken truths. After what felt like an eternity, the supervisor made his decision. "Lower your weapons," he ordered the two officers, his voice firm. "But sir," I said, "lower your weapons." There was no room for argument in his tone. Reluctantly, the officers holstered their guns, their faces still tight with unresolved tension. The supervisor turned to Malcolm, his gaze softening just a fraction. "Let's get you medical attention. You're hurt." Malcolm shook his head, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. "I don't need your help. I just want to go home." "You're bleeding, son," the supervisor said, more gently this time, gesturing to the deep gash on Malcolm's leg. Malcolm looked down at his injury, feeling the sting intensify now that the surge of the chase had passed. Blood soaked his torn jeans, the wound ugly and raw. But he wasn't ready to back down yet. Not after everything. "I've had worse," he muttered, though his voice betrayed a hint of weariness. His body was beginning to catch up to the pain, and the fight within him, while still burning strong, was starting to feel like an enormous weight. The supervisor sighed, clearly recognizing that Malcolm was no ordinary suspect. There was no winning here by force. Instead, he crouched slightly, making his voice more personal, as if trying to bridge the gulf between them. "I don't know what happened here tonight, but I don't want to see anyone else get hurt. Let us help you." The world seemed to slow again, and for the first time, Malcolm saw an opportunity to stand down without feeling like he was giving up. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about living with dignity. He nodded, finally allowing the weight of the situation to settle in. "All right," he said, exhaustion evident in his voice. "But I'm not your suspect." "You're wrong." The supervisor nodded, signaling to one of the paramedics who had just arrived. As they began to tend to Malcolm's wounds, a small crowd started to form at the edge of the scene. Neighbors, witnesses, people who had seen the chase unfold, stood watching in silence. Malcolm noticed them out of the corner of his eye, their expressions a mixture of concern and curiosity. The paramedic worked quickly, wrapping his leg and checking his other injuries. As they did, Malcolm's mind began to clear, the events of the night replaying over and over. How quickly everything had escalated. How easily his life could have ended on that street. As the pain in his leg dulled, his thoughts turned to what would come next. He had stood up for himself, demanded his dignity, but he knew this wasn't the end of the story. There would be questions, investigations, maybe even court hearings. But he had survived, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. He hadn't allowed them to break him. Part 7, Aftermath. In the days that followed, the story of Malcolm's confrontation with the police spread. Neighbors shared their accounts of the night, some speaking to reporters, others posting videos of the incident online. The media picked up the story, framing it as yet another instance of racial profiling and police brutality. Malcolm's name was now in headlines, discussed on talk shows, debated in newsrooms. He became a symbol, not just of survival, but of resistance. But for Malcolm, the fight wasn't over. As the days turned into weeks, he found himself at the center of legal proceedings. Civil rights lawyers reached out, eager to represent him in what they saw as a potential landmark case. Malcolm was torn. He had never wanted to be a symbol or a hero. All he had wanted was to go home, yet, he couldn't ignore the larger implications of what had happened. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the countless others who had been in his position, who hadn't been so lucky to walk away. And so, reluctantly, Malcolm agreed to let the lawyers take his case forward. The lawsuit against the police department was filed within a month. The charges: racial profiling, excessive use of force, and violation of civil rights. The officers involved were placed on administrative leave, pending the investigation. The city braced itself for the media storm and the protests that were sure to follow. For Malcolm, the days were long and the nights restless. He couldn't escape the feeling that, despite everything, justice might still elude him. He had lived through this system his entire life. He knew how it worked, how it protected those in power and crushed those without, but something had changed in him. He wasn't the same man he had been before that night. He had found a strength within himself, a voice that refused to be silenced. And that, more than anything, gave him hope. Part 8, Dignity reclaimed. Months passed, and the trial began. The courtroom was packed, reporters and spectators alike eager to see how the case would unfold. Malcolm sat at the plaintiff's table, his legs still healing but his spirit unbroken. His lawyer, a sharp-witted woman with years of civil rights cases under her belt, stood by his side, ready to fight for his justice. The trial was grueling. The defense painted the officers as heroes, men who had acted under pressure, doing their job in dangerous circumstances. They portrayed Malcolm as a suspect who had provoked the situation, who had run instead of complying, who had resisted. But Malcolm's lawyer was relentless. She tore apart the officer's testimony, showing video footage, witness accounts, and the stark reality of the racial profiling that had taken place that night. Slowly, the truth came to light. The system that had tried to crush Malcolm was now being held to account. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and media frenzy, the jury deliberated. The courtroom was silent as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. Malcolm held his breath. Guilty. The words rang out, echoing in the courtroom. A wave of relief washed over Malcolm, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was just one battle in a much larger war. As he stepped outside the courthouse, the bright sun shining down on him, Malcolm felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders, if only for a moment. He had fought for his dignity, and he had won. But the fight for justice, for equality, was far from over. In the distance, he could hear the chants of protesters, see the signs demanding change. And for the first time in a long time, Malcolm felt hope, because now, he wasn't fighting alone. Epilogue, a new beginning. The months following the trial were a whirlwind. Malcolm's story had ignited a fire in the community, sparking conversations about systemic racism, police reform, and the value of human dignity. He was asked to speak at rallies, to share his experience with others who had suffered in silence for far too long. At first, Malcolm was hesitant. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight, never wanted to be the face of a movement. But as he stood before crowds of people, all of them looking to him for strength and guidance, he realized that this was his path now. He had been given a voice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. And so, Malcolm spoke. He shared his story, his pain, his resilience. He spoke of the night he had almost lost everything, and the fight he had waged to reclaim his dignity. And in doing so, he gave others the courage to do the same. The world didn't change overnight. There were still battles to be fought, still injustices to be corrected. But Malcolm knew that as long as people were willing to stand up, to demand their dignity, there was hope. And for the first time in his life, Malcolm allowed himself to believe in that hope, because he had fought for his life, and won.